What's the strangest conspiracy theory you heard that actually turned out to be true? Project MK Ultra, aka CIA mind control program. That stuff is terrifying. One of the people believed to be a researcher involved in Ultra was Henry Murray, a famous psychologist and professor at Harvard. He was responsible for developing the field of personology and developing some early profiling tests. He's also partially responsible for driving the Unabomber off the deep end. During the 50s and 60s, he was commissioned by the US government in order to condition pilots in case they get captured if their planes get shot down, so they don't reveal secrets under torture. Unfortunately, he tested these theories to fine-tune them on students, which meant just screwing with them. In a separate experiment, which the Unabomber was the victim of, worked like this. Students were instructed to write an essay summarizing their personal philosophy on life and underlying principles, then went into a room expecting to debate philosophy with a fellow student. They instead faced an interrogation by a far more experienced opponent, whose sole purpose was to attack and ridicule their beliefs at length. Since one of the main goals of the experiment was to induce stress and upset the subject as much as possible, it's not surprising that many students came out feeling traumatized. Operation Midnight Climax. US government hired Essex workers to dose Johns with LSD to test mind control capabilities. Then, they expanded the program to dose citizens at restaurants and other public places. Bonus: a lot of government research projects discussed in The Men Who Stare at Goats, like be able to kill goats through staring and mind power. The NSA conducting mass domestic and foreign surveillance, courtesy of Edward Snowden. I don't know why anyone thought this wasn't true. It was literally in the Patriot Act that the government now had free reign to spy on people. This was one that people just didn't want to believe until they had to. There was so much evidence even before Snowden. The CIA recruited top American journalists to spread propaganda in the media and gather intelligence. How the CIA was proposing population control, and JFK considered it, but turned it down. The #FREBRITNY conspiracy. I saw so many people on Instagram especially that were just convinced that all her weird Instagram videos were cries for help, because she was being controlled by the scenes and thought it was kind of a ridiculous theory. But with everything that came out in her court cases in the later half of 2020, it seems like all of that was actually correct. Britney Spears really was in an abusive overbearing conservatorship for over a decade. The whole Hobby Lobby funded Al-Qaeda theory. Absolutely wild. From an FOIA request in court, it came out the CIA was actually trying to read our brainwaves with radio waves. It didn't work, but still. Some customer I talked to somehow ended up on a rambling tangent about how he was part of a mission in the Vietnam War, where they were controlling the weather on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Yeah. Okay buddy, sure. I looked it up later, and it turns out Operation Popey actually happened. That NBA refs were betting on games in the early 2000s. Love Canal, a nice neighborhood built on a toxic waste dump. Babies were born with birth defects, and many anomalies such as enlarged feet, heads, hands, and legs. Adults died with mysterious illnesses. It took years for the government and corporate America to take responsibility. This is going to be a YouTube video or BuzzFeed post. The US government dumping massive amounts of crack into black communities in the 80s. The small university I went to had an influx of students from other countries between school years, and there was a conspiracy theory going along that it was illegal and that the university was bringing over people who had not passed language exams etc. to inflate enrollment numbers, and that everyone in administration was in on it. At first I thought it was xenophobic nonsense, but nope. It was all true and quite a few people did time over it. November 2019. Times of India newspaper. Small snippet of news in the global section of the paper. A new disease found in China. Then a few days later news that China is building a new hospital in 10 days. I told my family that this is gonna be a problem in the coming year. They told me to shut up and not say stuff like that. January 2021, and no one remembers what I said. The government actively participated in UFO disinformation campaigns. Project Sunshine. Eisenhower's answerable to his gory deeds. Not the strangest, but the British Army murdered 14 unarmed civilians during a peaceful civil rights march in my city, Derry, Northern Ireland in 1972. The official line for years was that the victims were armed and had attacked the soldiers first. The Sun newspaper in the UK printed a story the next day portraying the soldiers as heroes and the victims as terrorists. The government eventually admitted about 10 years ago that none of the victims were armed and the killings were not provoked. Makes it hard to believe anything the government or media say. This is very Southern high school football, but there was a conspiracy theory that was mostly treated as a joke that these two high schools were bribing kids who were good at football into moving into their districts. Mostly it was spurred by the realization that a bunch of star players on both teams were transfers and had been for years. It was mostly laughed off because most of them claimed that they moved for the better football program rather than the other way around. Eventually there was an investigation and basically the coaches, with financial support from God knows where, we are literally paying for apartments for these families to change high school neighborhoods so they could join their program, and in at least 2 cases, bought them cars. Operation Northwoods. When Fidel Castro came to power, the CIA planned to commit acts of terrorism on American citizens, shooting down passenger planes, gunning down people in the streets, etc., and blame it on Cuba to get an excuse to go to war with them. Luckily, JFK shut them down, and they allowed these documents to be made public. Why? Suddenly I don't trust the CIA so much. Perhaps they have improved their methods since. I hope. The solitaire and Minesweeper games included with Windows were actually training tools to teach users how to use a mouse to right-click, double-click, and drag. USB ports are deliberately made to be difficult to orient in order to gently habituate users into the abort, rethink, retrieve mental paradigm which is so useful when dealing with computers. Before Maxis started making games like SimCity and The Sims, their first commercial program was a training simulation for managing a petroleum refinery. They realized the game potential of this kind of software when the end users training to run the refinery found it more fun to simulate catastrophic refinery accidents. When I worked in the warehouse of a company whose motto was everything AZ, we had people who'd been there years swear that every few years they'd do upgrades on the large routers hanging from the ceiling. Not to improve connectivity of our scanners, but to make the RFID of our badges easier to track. A few years ago, after leaving the company, I had a while to talk with a member of corporate who said that the company invested several million in mesh networks to track employees a year and the scanners were trash that couldn't be improved on, but they were cheap, and the employees being on task was worth 6 times the cost of replacing the scanners. Not sure if this counts as a conspiracy theory, but when my family went to SeaWorld after the chamois show, I said that I thought there was something very wrong about the orca's flat dorsal fin. My parents told me that I was being annoying and that he was fine. A few years later the trainer was killed and blackfish came out, and my family saw that I was right about the whales not being healthy. Well, it was a very local conspiracy theory, high school rumors. But basically this one teacher and another teacher, a few months after a class trip they both chaperoned, they got married, and 9 months after the trip she gave birth. Kind of local, but a bunch of people in my workplace in the 1990s spread a rumor that the supervisor was a crook and was stealing from the company. Other people dismissed the conspiracy, saying that those spreading the rumor were mad at the supervisor for giving them crap assignments and bad schedules. Years later, they found out the supervisor was faking his time cards and claiming hours worked and overtime when he wasn't even on property. After he was fired, the whole group was like, told ya so. That the CIA were running cocaine into the US to pay for arms for Contras. I wasn't really sure if it was true until I watched a Netflix doc the other night that showed John Kerry interviewing some dude from the CIA who confirmed it. In November of last year, my brother's friend said coronavirus will change our lives and it will be the next pandemic. At the time I thought that he was full of S, but here we are now. The Brahmin priest Holocaust in Kashmir, India, performed by radical Islamic terrorists. I love how even Indian media failed to broadcast this news. It hasn't been solved yet, the conspiracy of who buys the most glitter in the world. The Americans' banana war. MK Ultra is the most well-known example, for sure, but I have to imagine the reality is much worse than what we've discovered so far. In 1984, the National Enquirer, think cheap gossip paper, ran a front page story on how the USAF had a wing of invisible jets. From then on, any time the Air Force was asked about it, they would deadpan like the National Enquirer story, and no real reporter would ask any follow-up questions. 4 years later, USAF confessed to having stealth airplanes that are invisible to radar. Till the CIA are up to a whole load of s. That the government was planning to attack itself and make it look like Cuba did it. I forget the name of the declassified documents, but it's true. It's one of the chips the 9/11 goofs like to play. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq were made up bullshit to justify the war on Iraq. Every mainstream news outlet was running daily coverage that Saddam had them. We had to go in there. Blah blah. Total bullshit. 200,000 civilian deaths. Millions of displaced people. F government and F the media. They do this every single time. Doesn't matter who's in charge. The bureaucracy is a real government, not the temporary managers. Chemicals turning frogs gay. Not quite true, but close enough. It turns out, if you dump a bunch of, now banned, plastics into the habitats of amphibians which determine sex through hormones, rather than chromosomes, then they can spontaneously change gender. A lot of people missing the actually turned out to be true part. The USA funded wars by selling crack to black people. Hammarskjöld was assassinated. SAIMR exists. Only the UN denies it at this point. The universe can be a donut shape. Did you know that Who Framed Roger Rabbit is a true story?